Hi, welcome to Checking In with Amy. My name is Amy Goldberg and I'm a registered nurse with Neighborhood PACE. PACE stands for Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly, that being 55 years of age and older. Our catchment area is East Boston, Chelsea, Revere, Winthrop, and Everett, Malden, Medford, Melrose, Stoneham, and Boston's North End. The goal of Neighborhood PACE is to keep people living in their homes in a healthy, safe, independent manner. Our guest today is Casey Carson. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
And what we're going to talk about today is grief and loss. And because this is the time of the year, it's the holiday season, we see a lot of anxiety and depression and so forth around grief and loss. So let's talk about some common losses that people might be experiencing.
Sure. So common losses, I mean, everybody experiences loss, right? But, you know, as people age, the losses become bigger and more frequent, certainly. Some common losses that everybody experiences from time to time: loss of independence, siblings and children, spouses either by death or divorce, terminal and or chronic illness diagnoses, cognitive impairment, physical ability, pets, and loss of home and or job. Today we're going to be mostly focusing on the loss of a loved one because it's a universal loss.
Sometimes people, and I could be one of them, that worry about things before they even happen. You know, you're just like, oh, this could happen. And then you're anxious about losses and they haven't even happened yet. So do you want to talk about that?
So that's called anticipatory grief. It's the first phase of grief, and it happens when you or your loved one are expecting to die. So when somebody's anticipating somebody else to die, they may feel sadness or tearfulness. They may experience insomnia, or on the opposite end, sleeping too much, some other physical problems that may come with anticipating a loss, whether that's physical pain, trouble with your memory, disorientation. Guilt is another big component of anticipatory grief. Sometimes the person who is expecting the loss of a loved one will wonder, why not me? Why is it my loved one that's sick and I'm not? There's anxiety and fear, as I mentioned before. You're anticipating something to happen before it does. Replaying of the event is another big piece of anticipatory grief, focusing so much on the time of death, how the death is going to occur, the funeral. All of these pieces can replay in somebody's mind over and over before it actually happens, which in turn causes anxiety. And then ultimately anger and loss of control of other emotions, whether that's angry at the loved one for becoming sick, yourself. Sometimes people are angry at God or whoever they feel is their higher power. So it can be challenging for people.
I know. And so let's talk about coping with anticipatory grief. What can people do instead of just sitting around worrying and being anxious? Maybe there are things people can do.
Sure. So one of the biggest things that people can do is let the emotion out. So often we think, oh, if I just forget about it, if I just push it aside, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, that's not the reality, and it will happen, and it's going to take you recognizing that it's going to happen. So expressing your emotions. Sometimes finding support groups can be really helpful. Spending time with your loved one. Don't forget that your loved one is still alive. And so often we forget that this person is still living because we're too busy planning for their death. We forget to enjoy our time that we have with them. Involving children is also really necessary if they're part of the loved one's life. And Amy, I think you were telling me when we were doing this, an incident when you were younger, if you wanted to share that.
Right. So basically what happened is, in my family growing up, I was an only child, and they were always protecting me. So when my grandmother actually passed away, I was told to go to the back of the room and don't move, just stay back there. So really I wasn't part of anything. And so death and losing someone was very, very difficult for me as the years went on because it wasn't considered part of the life process.
Sure. Yeah. So introducing death as part of the life process to children will hopefully instill a sense of this is what life is all about.
Right.
I will go through this for the rest of my life, and how can I manage this better as I get older? So thank you. And another component of coping with anticipatory grief would be spirituality. Some people run from spirituality when they're anticipating such a big loss. Like I said earlier, they can become angry. But there are a lot of people who find a lot of comfort in spirituality, whether that's reconnecting with a church group or other organization. And then one of the final pieces of coping with anticipatory grief is forgiveness. And this doesn't apply to everybody, but certainly taking care of unfinished business is important before somebody dies. You'd never want to lose somebody that you love and then feel that there was something more you could have said or should have said. So forgiveness can be a really helpful, healing moment for both the loved one and the person who is about to die.
And I've told, everyone that over the years. I said, you really need to, just like you said, finish business, express how you feel to the loved one. And many times people that are at the end stage of life might not be able to talk to you, but they hear everything that you're saying. So even if you weren't able to talk in a dialogue back and forth, at least you'll be able to express yourself to them. Yeah. The next thing is acute grief. So you found a very nice saying that I thought was beautiful. And for acute grief, it said, no one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. So let's talk about acute grief. What should someone look for?
So acute grief is the immediate aftershock after somebody passes away. It's ultimately experienced the same across the board. The symptoms of acute grief are similar to shock. Panic symptoms, so if anybody has had a panic attack, they would know what those are: shortness of breath, chest pain, arm or leg numbness, similar symptoms of a panic attack. Crying or sobbing, loss of appetite, loss of sexual drive, anxiety and or depression, avoidance or dependence. So if somebody's avoiding others or being withdrawn, then that would be one end of it. And then if somebody cannot be alone and they don't want to separate from other loved ones or friends, then that would be the other side of it.
So coping with acute grief, easier said than done. But when someone's going through acute grief, the last thing they do is take good care of themselves. Sure. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so when you're going through acute grief, you're right. The last thing that you're thinking about is yourself usually. You're contemplating your history with this person, what happens next, concrete tasks, taking care of funeral arrangements and things like that you're not taking time to take care of yourself. So health is the most important piece of getting through acute grief safely. So getting enough sleep, getting enough food and hydration. Another big piece to coping with acute grief is avoid suppressing emotion. So often some people will use alcohol or other substances to numb their pain. And I'm sure it can be easy to have the funerals and the get-togethers and you're around other people and it doesn't seem like you're numbing your pain, but often the longer you suppress those emotions, the more painful it becomes later on down the road. Self-compassion is so important in this time. So often we easily have compassion and empathy for other people when they're suffering, but we forget to have compassion and empathy for ourselves. I think it's important to remember that it's okay to not be okay. You just lost a huge piece of your life, and having that self-compassion hopefully would spark awareness of your own health and how you're doing during this time. And last but not least, seeking out immediate help by calling 911 if necessary. So certainly if you're feeling suicidal or like you're going to harm yourself or someone else, that would be a good and appropriate time to reach out for help.
Thank you, that's good. So let's talk about what comes after acute grief. And you found another very beautiful saying, and I believe this. Grief is like the ocean. It comes on in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water's calm, sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn how to swim. So that's true. And so let's talk about after acute grief is integrated grief, and let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I chose that quote mainly to highlight the image of the waves, the grief wave, which I'll mention in a couple of minutes. So when looking for integrated grief, ultimately the pain is still there, but you're learning to build your life around that loss, which is extremely important to moving towards acceptance, which is the ultimate goal of grief itself. So it typically happens for people around 6 to 12 months, although grief is unique and doesn't happen the same for everybody, and so it could take longer or shorter to get to that stage for some people, but typically 6 to 12. The most important aspect of integrated grief is that you're able to achieve pleasure again while still accepting and understanding and realizing this pain. So you're able to do your favorite hobbies and spend time with other loved ones and friends, and you're able to do your errands and get things done, and you're able to find happiness again despite having this loss. And ultimately, the waves of grief, which I mentioned earlier, become shorter and less intense. So it's like a wave. You might be okay one day, and then something will remind you of that loss and that person, and then all of a sudden you might not be okay, and that's okay. Eventually those episodes will become less intense, and they will go away and they will come back. So.
And the exact thing happened to me. So when my mother passed away, and I mentioned I was an only child, mm-hmm. And my dad had passed away earlier, so I wanted her back. So it was about 6 months, mm-hmm. and all of a sudden it occurred to me that was enough, that it was time for her to come back. Mm-hmm. And I remember it vividly. It was like, I've been really, really good, but now it's enough. Let's stop playing this game and come on back and be with me. So it does, I can speak from experience, it does ebb and flow, mm-hmm. and it's not easy.
No. Just when you think it's over, it's not.
It's not over, I know. So now, some people go through this and they're doing very well, but then others get stuck. Mm-hmm. And that's concerning. So this is called complicated grief.
Yes.
So what are we looking for in that stage?
So complicated grief happens when someone has a difficult time, basically, accepting the loss and cannot move forward. It happens to around 7% or 10 million people in the United States annually. So that's a significant amount of people who have a difficult time accepting this loss. One of the first things to look for is a persistent longing for the loved one. So if they're constantly talking about the loved one, wishing that they were back, that's a sign that complicated grief may be arriving. Intense loneliness, preoccupying thoughts of the deceased, avoidance or preoccupation of places or people that remind you of that person. So some people may avoid certain outings in public or certain areas of the house, any trigger that would remind them of that person. Anger and pain or other physical symptoms. So like I said before, headaches, body aches, etc.
So this complicated grief, if it goes on, for how long would you say you'd be concerned or you'd want to seek out help?
So when somebody notices that maybe their loved one or friend is going through complicated grief, or if you realize it yourself that you're going through it, getting help as soon as you can is extremely important in order to combat some of these symptoms that might be arising. Coping with complicated grief is much more specific and intense than the other phases of grief, where you would normally just get support and maybe some education around the loss. Now it may require psychotherapy, which would specifically be therapy related to complicated grief. So these are therapists that are trained in dealing with grief that has surpassed the typical allotted time of grieving. Then there's also medication. Some people in their grief process may develop anxiety or depression that wasn't there originally, and they may need some type of medication, whether that's an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety, to combat some of these symptoms that may arise. And a lot of people benefit from spiritual counseling. So like I've said throughout this thing, a lot of people become angry with God or religion in general, anything that they view as their higher power, and it can be so healing to get spiritual counseling and to reconnect with something that's higher and bigger than yourself, and can provide a lot of comfort for people. And like I've said before, seeking out immediate help in this phase, if necessary, by calling 911 is extremely important. So certainly if anybody is feeling like they're going to hurt themselves or somebody else, we would certainly urge them to call for emergency help.
And I think it's hard as you get older, because I can speak from experience, that you want to be strong and I should be strong and I don't know if I really need medication and that's a weakness and all this. So I think pointing out like all these are very normal things and that you need to be open for it. Just talk to the doctor, therapist, whoever you're seeing, and be open-minded about getting the help you need.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think it's hard as you get older. I really do. So I want to know, how can just someone listening today, how can they help? Just, they're not therapists, they're not the doctors and the nurses and everything. They're just people who love you and want to help you. So what can they do?
So if you're supporting somebody who has gone through a major loss in their life, one of the most important things that you can do for somebody is to be available to them and be prepared to be with them for the long haul. So don't just show up when the loss happens and then kind of disappear a couple of months later. So be available and stick around. Initiate conversation. Initiating conversation is so important for somebody who has gone through a loss. Most of the time, people supporting a friend or loved one going through a loss might think, I don't want to bring this up.
Right.
I don't want to trigger this person. I don't want to remind them of their loss. They probably don't want to talk to me anyway. And I think me and you talked about how that can be troubling, because a lot of people who go through the loss don't want to initiate conversation. They don't want to bring the conversation down. So it's important as the friend or the loved one to ask them and to be there for them and to be ready to hear the response. So listening and encouraging is important. Being patient with the person, so if you ask them and they might not give a lot of information at first, be patient because they might come around. Assisting with practical tasks is important too. A lot of the times when people are grieving, they have a hard time keeping their own lives straight because they're worrying about A, B, and C. And having somebody there to assist with errands and household tasks and things that they might be neglecting to no fault of their own, but just because they're preoccupied, is extremely helpful. And also being aware of triggers. So certainly around this time of year, Christmas and other holidays are really triggering for a lot of people, not only people who have experienced a loss, but for many other reasons. So be aware of your loved ones' triggers, whether that's holidays, anniversaries, birthdays, music, anything can be helpful in supporting somebody.
And it's interesting because a lot of people say, call me if you need anything. And that the person who's going through the loss is not going to call.
Right.
So you need to show up and say, let's go food shopping together, or let me help you file some papers.
Sure.
You need to be it needs to be tangible.
Yep.
But this general call me at some point, let me know, it's not going to happen.
Sure. Leaving it up in the air is not is not beneficial for anybody.
Right.
And you're right, it's just better to be direct with that person and say, how can I help you today? What do you need me to do?
Right.
Genuinely be there for that
And then
person.
show up in the house.
Right.
Right. So we do have, as the last slide, some suggested reading, which both of us have read, so at least we know these are good
Sure.
things. There's plenty more out there, so if people are interested, of course, they can get in touch with us. So, Casey, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation today. And if you or anyone you know needs help in regard to any of the subjects that we've talked about in the past, please feel free to call Neighborhood PACE. Our phone number is 617-568-6377. And until we meet again, please be well and take care of yourself. Bye now.
Do you or someone you care for need help staying at home and remaining independent, active, and healthy? Neighborhood PACE, an approved and sponsored program of Mass Health and Medicare, provides all-inclusive health care for adults 55 and older.
Doctor's visits, medication, transportation, socialization. What else could I need? I get it all through Neighborhood PACE.
To learn more about how the Neighborhood PACE program can help, visit neighborhoodpace.org.